Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. Thought it was going to be a slower news week. Was kind of worried about what I was going to talk about in this video. And then the Peter German report on money laundering in the real estate market in BC gave me a gift, so lots to talk about there. I'm going to touch a little bit on more other policy-making interactions that we've had over the past week, and then a little bit of tidbits on the Toronto housing market, sort of give my thoughts on that. But first and foremost, obviously the Peter German report coming out and saying that in 2018, $5 billion was laundered through real estate across the province of BC. Again, this is the guy, he's the expert on money laundering. I'm certainly not the expert. This guy spent his entire career. He's one of the most respected persons. So I feel like if we're going to get a sense or a gauge on how much money laundering is taking place, this is probably the guy that's going to give you the answer. And he spent, I believe, the last year detailing and writing and finalizing this report. So again, $5 billion. You say, well, what is $5 billion? Just for context, in residential real estate for 2018, there was $55 billion spent on residential real estate across the province of BC in 2018. So it's basically 9% of residential real estate transactions are in the form of illicit money. Now, the report hasn't been released publicly. It also doesn't state if that $5 billion went into simply residential. Did it go into commercial real estate? We don't know. But assuming that it all went into residential real estate, that would equate to 9% of sales volume. So obviously not an insignificant number. But again, BNN, I did an interview for BNN Bloomberg earlier today, and they're just asking me for stories about, money laundering and, what have you seen, and give us some stories. I said, I don't really have any stories. I don't work with money launderers, obviously. And, it's not like I see it and go, oh, that's a money laundering case. But there's certainly times when you're feet on the ground perspective. There's certainly times when you're looking at sales, you're scratching your head going, what? Why did this guy pay that price? Why did this person buy this $4 million home, and then a month later it's back on the MLS after they close on it and it's back up for sale? And some of these now, back up for sale and taking $1 million loss, you're kind of like, well, like, who does that? So obviously there's transactions that, raise a red flag. Of course, they in the report, they estimate that this pushed prices up by 5%. Again, I don't know how they determine that number. Certainly, we know that prices are generally set at the margin. Obviously, if it's illicit money, they're price insensitive buyers. Their mandate, their job is to clean the money, not to necessarily make a profit and try to haggle $10,000 off a home seller so they can get the best deal. It's basically, it's more so price insensitive money. So I don't know, how this impacts things moving forward, but clearly this is the number. And the interesting thing to look at it is, if it was $5 billion in 2018, which is 2018 was a slow year for BC transactions. If we were to go back to say 2015, 2016, which is really your peak of your Chinese capital flows, some of it legal, some of it illicit, that was the peak of the capital flight into the residential housing market, not only just in Vancouver, but globally. So certainly that $5 billion would have been much higher in those years. So how much of that impacted prices? Again, I don't know. I can't really speculate on that, but certainly, prices, detached home prices in 2015, 2016 rose by 30-40% each year. So that was really the peak of the market when you had luxury houses being flipped like penny stocks. So certainly this report comes out well after the fact, and this is very typical of these financial euphorias where nobody ever questions things as they're going up. Everybody just generally partakes. And it's only after the air starts to get let out that all of a sudden everybody starts asking, like, what the hell went wrong? How did we get here? What happened? And all of these reports start coming out. So that's always been my thesis. If you've gone back and watched any of these videos, the thesis has always been Chinese capital flight came in 2015. Again, whether illicit or legally. It came in, it kind of started the party, and then you basically had prices rising, and that creates a positive feedback loop where locals can also then come in and start to speculate, and they were able to basically speculate and partake in the rising housing market through the easy credit mechanism, which is the low central bank interest rates, easy credit. I mean, obviously we know where home prices were and what incomes are, so then there's no question there was a lot of leverage there as well from a local perspective that was able to partake in this euphoric rise in home prices. And so the banks are just as much complicit in this in terms of their lending. Basically everybody sort of partook in this party, and again now, as things start to slow down and unwind, 33-year low in home sales across Greater Vancouver to start the year, everybody's asking questions. But unfortunately, it's too late. We should have been asking these questions years ago. But anyways, that's what it is. I continue to be amazed from a policy-making perspective. Just to quickly show, I want to quickly show the BC sales volumes. Just look at this sales volumes. You can clearly see where sales volumes peaked in BC and where they are today. So in terms of where the money was flowing, or when it was flowing, it is pretty evident. But just to go back to the policy-making perspective, policymakers, whether you're a provincial government now coming out and reporting on this money laundering scandal, you also, every level of government continues to be adamant about clamping down on housing. You've had not only the BC government come out this week, but you had CMHC's Siddall come out as well, saying, basically defending his stress test and telling all the industry guys that they can basically go and shove it. And his sole focus is on controlling the quality of household debt and getting that level of indebtedness down. It's the same thing that Bank of Canada Governor Pelosi talked about last week. So you still have all levels of government basically pointing their guns, pointing their arrows at the Canadian housing market. So unless those policymakers start to change their attitude and their opinion towards the housing market, I continue to be skeptical that you're going to see any sort of housing inflation in the near-term future. I think that certainly the market conditions in Vancouver continue to point lower. Just looking at CMHC's Siddall, this guy basically controls the mortgage market. He gave an interview to Bloomberg, basically telling everybody that household debt was out of control and this party is going to come to an end. And I'm not even going to put words in his mouth. I'm going to clip right now to this interview. So let's just clip it here.
What is the current biggest vulnerability of the system? Indebtedness continues to be a concern.
It is still indebtedness. It is still indebtedness among younger people.
Yep.
Because people tend to default when they lose their jobs within the first or second year of a mortgage. So that's what we're worried about.
And so along with that has come this question of where we are in the economic cycle, right?
Right.
You get the double whammy of job losses and housing market that still needs to correct a little bit. Your thinking on that? We've taken the R word off the table for the most part compared to a couple of months ago. Yeah,
that's right. My thinking is we're still vulnerable because we're so financially leveraged to anything that could happen, offshore, trade wars, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't know what the next big thing's going to be. We do know that we have fewer arrows in our quiver to respond to it.
You have called for a very ambitious goal on housing affordability that every Canadian should be able. It sounds like
by 2030.
By 2030, and you're going to raise private capital to do it.
We are trying to raise private capital.
What does that look like?
Well, we don't know. What I do know is, it's like Kennedy saying we'll be on the moon within 10 years. If you don't try to do it, and I'm no John Kennedy, but if you don't try to do something, you won't even get partway there.
Right.
And it's not enough for a Crown Corporation to say, we'll take the government's money and do what the government wants us to do. We have a bunch of people who can do more, and so we're aspiring to do more.
And when we talk about affordability, what's on the list? Because we saw the recent provincial government in Ontario make changes to the pace, we think, the rate at which homes might get built. But will they be the right kind of homes? Will they be rental? Will they be low income? And these are all kind of the questions. Are you talking about that kind of thing, targeting areas?
Yeah, we're talking about the federal government, which is back in the housing game now as a result of the National Housing Strategy, having withdrawn in the 90s. Provinces certainly, which have the lion's share of that responsibility, municipalities as well, and working together. More is more in terms of housing. We need more supply.
We need very specific types of supply, right?
Well, we do, but housing's a continuum, and so and you can be imbalanced certainly, but for now we need more.
Of every type.
Of almost every type.
So if we
in
talk,
places like Toronto and Vancouver.
if we talk about the precarious housing, the need for more rental, are there mechanisms that you could use this private capital for to encourage the building of those types of housing units?
Yeah, we have a program that was substantially expanded in the last budget by $10 billion and extended in term from 5 to 9 years. That's part of our answer to it, but we have an infrastructure at CMHC that, for example, Microsoft is investing in housing for its employees in Seattle. Big employers here could do the same thing. There are concerns about the affordability of places like Toronto and Vancouver, and CEOs are thinking, gee, should I move to Mississauga? Should I move to Abbotsford? Well, if they invest in housing, they don't have to do that.
There have been criticisms about the first-time home buyers initiative. You've seen them. Tim Hudak has been quite vocal about this. What's your response to those criticisms? That it doesn't go far enough, that it's a nice idea, but it's not doing as much as it could? It
is deliberately designed to be a surgical response to people being excluded from the market. And so because it's a marginal program, people are being excluded at the margin. Mm-hmm. It's targeted right there. And if it were much larger, Amanda, it would have an inflationary effect. Our estimate is that across the country, it will have a 0.02 to 0.04% maximum impact on house prices. It's not inflationary.
Can you test all that when you think through policies? Can you test in advance, like model whether they will have an effect on price? You don't want to. You want to stay neutral all the time?
You want to do your best to try and test it, but there's behavioral assumptions. Mm-hmm. We're using 2018 data. That data set excluded a bunch of people whom this could attract. We don't really know. But we do our best because we've got to give advice to ministers based on the evidence we have.
Would you like to see certain markets cool further than they have? We still have, of course, Vancouver, obviously not necessarily done what you might have expected. Even Toronto still feels in some ways frothy.
On the one hand, I would. On the other hand, what's behind it is economic growth and job growth and immigration. Yeah. And that's good for these cities. So the fundamentals are good fundamentals. In a sense, it's a high-class problem. But yeah, we need cheaper housing in this country.
When we think about just from a kind of a big picture policy point of view, the reason, of course, that your job, this role is so important is because housing is fundamental, right? Yeah. It matters to all of us. It matters that it be good. It matters that it be safe. It's become a massive economic issue. It's become a huge part of our economy. Yeah. Are we getting it slightly wrong in letting it be that important? In other words, this notion that people should be able to buy a home. In many cities of the world, they rent happily forever, for life.
That's exactly right. And I mentioned behavioral issues. Mm-hmm. In places like Paris and Sydney and Hong Kong, Buenos Aires, people rent. Yep. Yeah, New York. People rent. Whereas here we glorify home ownership and we think it's the only vehicle for savings. Well, that's looking at the last 100 years. And unfortunately, savings are in the future, not in the past. And I think, this party ultimately comes to an end. And the people who are going to get hurt are young people. And so that's why the first-time homebuyers incentive is deliberately meant to help them without pushing prices even higher.
So as long as these guys, continue to take this sort of stance, I think it's definitely something we should be paying attention to. But last and foremost, talking about the Toronto housing market, people ask me about that. I do continue to be, admittedly, surprised about the resilience of the Toronto housing market. But one thing I will add is, yes, the sales numbers are up on a year-over-year basis, but you have to remember that last April was the slowest April in a decade. So if you actually look at sales this April, they're still well below the 10-year average, which, again, should be a little bit concerning given the rate of population growth and immigration into the city. So it is still really in a weak channel in terms of sales volumes. Prices are kind of just moving sidelines. The whole market is there's certain pockets that are up, kind of creeping up, certain markets that are coming a little bit down. So basically, in general, it seems to me like it's just kind of moving sideways. And again, I'm not going to pretend to be like the micro expert on the Toronto housing market. But if you were to ask me what I feel, me speculating and feeling, what is a potential catalyst to have the Toronto housing market begin to somewhat follow, the housing market in Vancouver down, I think it's likely what is going to happen or what is happening in Vancouver, and that is sales are extremely weak, as we know. Prices are still moving lower across all property segments, and this is going to increase defaults. This is going to increase loan loss provisions at Canadian banks, and a result of that, Canadian banks are going to have to continue to tighten their screws. And I think once those loan loss provisions really tick up in Vancouver, assuming that this market continues to move lower, that they're going to have to tighten the screws elsewhere across the board, and that's typically what we see, in these boom bust patterns, so to speak. So again, not saying that is the be all end all and 100% that's going to happen, but if you ask me, that's my thoughts for what is potentially a catalyst for Toronto to no longer move sideways but move down. I think that's likely the case. So anyways, I hope this video helped. Otherwise, see you next week.